Hello friends, this is Growl. In this video, I'm going to go over this week's affixes in Mythic Plus, along with some tips for adjusting, and a heads up on some of the difficult situations coming your way. Today, we are shooting from the Chamber of Heart, where you'll be spending the week doing all the horrific visions you were too lazy to do the last couple weeks, because now there's nobody to play with. This week is Tyrannical Raging Explosive, which I would describe as a slow week but pretty easy to execute. This is an extremely bad week for high keys, but you may have better luck in lower keys where time isn't as big of a constraint, especially compared to last week, Grievous Bolstering, which isn't too bad in high keys but is a nightmare in pugs. You'll likely see almost no top keys time because the affixes take significantly longer to deal with than most others. Tyrannical makes boss fights drag on for 4 or 5 minutes at a time, and Explosive forces you to pull smaller than you'd like and waste valuable damage dealing with explosive orbs. If you insist on playing this week, I would look to bring as much damage as possible on a healer while still being able to get through the Tyrannical fights, since everything is going to be going slower than normal. Explosive is a rough affix, especially for Resto Druid. The health of explosive orbs scale with key level, so the higher you go, the more frustrating they become. In lower keys, you can deal with them with just one Solar Wrath and a Moonfire, but as annoying as that is, eventually it won't even be enough. This is a week I bring Crucible Major in every dungeon to help with explosive orbs and damage, since your group's damage is going to be super low this week, not having to deal with explosives, and also you have no hope of doing high keys anyway because this week sucks. Other healers have an easier time dealing with explosive orbs, like Mistweaver's Rising Sun Kick or Paladin's Judgment, so explosive is definitely a week where it feels pretty bad to be a druid. Raging is a bit annoying, but druid does have good tools to deal with it. Soothe removes raging immediately on a 10-second cooldown, so any mobs that do significant, unavoidable damage is important to soothe immediately once they reach 30% HP. You can also Vortex and Typhoon to help your tank get away when large packs of mobs rage at the same time. I recommend using a focus target soothe macro, which I'll leave in the description. That way you can focus target the dangerous mobs early in the pack and soothe them later at the click of a button without having to worry about clicking on them through a sea of nameplates and ground effects. If you aren't a Resto Druid, it's definitely recommended to be playing with a Hunter or Druid this week for the soothe. Let's look at the dungeons this week. This week doesn't change much how you approach them, so there shouldn't be too fancy strategy going on here. First, let's look at Atoll. Atoll, I think, is reasonable this week. The two things you need to worry about are explosive orbs during this Toxic Swords pull, because often you're pulling 10 or 15 Toxic Swords at a time during Tyrannical. So there'll be lots of orbs you'll definitely be needing to help out as a healer. In Volcall, the explosive orbs can spawn off of the totems, so it's a good idea to be watching your team and seeing if they need help with either their totem or their explosive orb in the first phase. Other than that, there's not too much to be worried about here. I'm running my normal talent setup with Cenarian Warden Cultivation, as well as my normal Essence setup of Crucible, Well, Conflict, and Formless. Next is Freehold. Freehold is not too difficult of a week aside from the first two bosses, Crag and Eudora. For those two bosses, I usually like to recommend Soul and Prosperity if you're having trouble dealing with them, since the rest of the dungeon won't be too difficult. There will be some big trash pulls where you'll need to help with explosives, but other than that, it's nothing too challenging. One thing to note on the last boss, Harlan Sweet, very often the strategy is to CC one of the Grenadiers. However, it can spawn explosive orbs, so I like to hold the Crucible charge to use on those explosive orbs if they spawn, since often your team isn't watching them. So this is a week where I wouldn't mind going Prosperity and Soul of the Forest just to help with the burst healing on Eudora and Crag, since those will be the most difficult parts of the dungeon, although I'm keeping my same essence setup of Crucible Major and Formless Minor. King's Rest is similar to Freehold in that it won't be too challenging other than dealing with the bosses this week. Make sure you don't forget to soothe Zool or any of the champion mobs or any of the mobs in the gauntlet room because everything will hurt bad with raging. The only difficult explosive pulls will be the embalming fluids in Machimba's room, as well as Zanzil, the totem boss. When the totems spawn, it's likely your team will be following around the boss, so the totems on the other side of the room, it's a good idea to either use your crucible charges or just be catting those down to help them out because your team can miss them. They'll be spawning off of all of the totems. I don't usually choose to do too many talent changes in King's Rest. I just run my normal build of Cenarian Warden Cultivation. However, I have been experimenting with Germination, so if you want to try that, let me know how it goes. There are also some healers that like to run Prosperity and Soul of the Forest in King's Rest. I think that's totally fine too. For essences, the only substitution I make is changing Formless Miner with Spirit of Preservation Miner just to help with the additional single target healing. If you're really struggling with healing, you could choose Vitality Conduit Major instead of Crucible, but I think the damage loss just isn't worth it this week. Next, we can look at Shrine. Shrine isn't too difficult of a dungeon this week. You won't have any of the problems with bolstering that you did last week. However, Tyrannical slows everything down, especially with the last boss, where it's a phase boss and there'll be explosive orbs spawning from his ads, so you have to be really, really careful there. Luckily, you will probably have the buff that increases your damage, so you can pretty easily take the explosive orbs down. There's not too much to worry about other than you'll be needing help with explosives during these attendant or these initiate pulls in the very first room and in the second boss area. Shrine is a dungeon where I like to add a little bit more damage as a healer if I can get away with it just to help the bosses go by faster, but otherwise I'm just running my normal talent setup here and my normal essence setup with Formless Void Miner. Siege is very difficult on Tyrannical, but Raging will be likely easier to execute than Bolstering. You can still use the Raging Spotter to take out monkeys in Monkey Town. However, you don't have to worry about Giga Bolstering anything as there's no consequences to blowing up mobs. So you can eventually just finish the spotter. Although it is a bit slower than Bolstering, it's probably easier to execute in Pugs. There's not too many difficult challenges to deal with explosive orbs. Just be on the lookout for some of the bosses with ads, like the first boss if you're CCing any ads, or the second boss as well if there's some running around. Just try and help out with the explosives as best you can. Other than that, it's mostly a matter of just going through the dungeon in a straight line as quickly as possible. In Siege, I run a very similar setup to Shrine. I try and get away with a little bit more damage than normal, and my same essence and talent setups. Temple isn't too bad this week, but the toughest part by far is the last boss, Avatar of Sethralus. It's spawning 4 Hoodoo Hexers as well as Plague Doctors and Heart Guardians, and all of those ads can be dropping explosives. So on this boss, you'll have to deal with 5 to 6 times more explosives than you're used to. I generally like to stay on the opposite side of my team and help with the explosives that they're not near. Generally, explosive is the biggest challenge on this boss, so it's tough juggling the mix of helping with explosives and healing your team as well. Almost never do I choose to run Crucible and Temple, but I think that the last boss is the hardest part, so this is a week where I may do it. Otherwise, there's not too many difficult challenges with Raging or Explosive this week. I'm running my normal talent and essence setup here in Temple, but if you're really worried about mana for the bosses, you can swap out Crucible Major for Formless Major for the Stealing Lucid, or just Memory of Lucid Dreams yourself if you don't have a Lucid available to steal. I think Motherlode is going to be one of the easier dungeons this week. It's still a little bit of a challenge in the first area. It'll definitely give you a test on your soothing, since a lot of these mobs do insane amounts of burst damage to random party members, so they need to be soothed immediately once they start enraging. But explosive isn't too bad since you can't pull too big here, and besides raging, there's no problems here since it's not fortified. The bosses will be a bit slower, but there's no explosive challenges, and the Motherlode bosses aren't too difficult anyway. In general, I think this is a fine week for Motherlode. You'll probably have a much better time than you did in Pugs last week. In Motherlode, I choose to run my normal talent and essence setup with no changes. Underrot is a bit more difficult, but also not too bad. The Blood Swarmers in the second boss room will put your soothes to the test as well. You need to have those focused and ready to soothe immediately, because if they rage on a fixated target, they're just going to kill them in one hit. Otherwise, there's not too many challenges going on. You do need to make sure that you get Pragma down, it can be difficult on high keys on Tyrannical, but other than that, not too many challenges here. I like to run my normal Essence setup as well of Crucible Major, Formless Miner, same talents, Cenarian, Warden Cultivation. Toll de Gore, I would say, is moderate difficulty this week. The beach pulls and in general any big pulls that you do in Toll de Gore may be a bit harder. In Pugs, you may want to break this up into 2 pulls if you're not having faith in their ability to deal with the explosive orbs. Nope, that's not Jess Hollis's room. Jess Hollis's room can be a bit annoying as well, considering that all of these mobs are humanoid and they flee when they get low. So very often what you'll see happen is mobs run away and then end up dropping explosive orbs far away from your party when they're not noticing. So as a healer, I try and keep the mob's Vortex and Typhoon together so that all the explosive orbs are in the same place. And if I have to, I'll chase down the solo mobs and try and help out with those explosives. Other than that, there's not too much difficulty. Even though it is tyrannical, I choose my same essence and talent setup just to help with dungeon timer and to kill the explosives. Waitcrest can be a bit of a challenge this week. The tougher boss fights, the sisters and Lord and Lady Waitcrest, get even harder because of explosive orbs. The sisters, because there's 3 of them, spawn 3 times more explosive orbs than normal, so it's already a tougher damage check trying to beat those difficult spells, and now you have to deal with switching off the sisters constantly to deal with explosive orbs. Other than that, the trash will be okay. There's generally you usually pull bigger in Rawl's area on Tyrannical just because you're able to and you need to save time because the bosses take so long. However, it can become a problem for explosive. Just remember that you can line of sight explosive orbs. So if you're ever around this area in the hallways or outside and you don't have faith that your team is killing him, you can always just run behind a wall to line of sight them. Waitcrest is probably one of the few dungeons where I wouldn't take Crucible. I don't think it's a bad idea in higher keys, but usually I feel the healing check requires Ever Rising Tide Major and Spirit of Preservation Minor. No talent changes I usually make here, although I think Renewal is a fine option if you don't find much use out of Wild Charge in this dungeon. Junkyard is usually pretty easy. There's not much problem with Junkyard. The problems that you have with damage checks go away because of Zapbots, so your team can happily focus on killing explosive orbs and not worry too much about them. In Junkyard, I would mainly just be focused on dealing with the bosses, because if you get through the bosses, all the trash is going to melt very easily. There's not really any difficult situations. In the Trog area, you may have problems with explosives, but if you are just vigilant at killing them, it shouldn't be too bad at all. There's no reason to not be focusing explosives heavily from all party members. In Junkyard, I usually choose to run Guardian Affinity just because damage doesn't quite matter. I like Mass Roots as well for the last boss, although you do get some use out of Typhoon as well. For essences, I'll usually choose Ever Rising Tide Major and Spirit of Preservation Minor again, although if you wanted to run the normal Crucible build, I think that would be fine too. You could also try Formless Void Major or Lucid Dreams Major if you're worried about healing the boss fights. Trog, Gunker, and the last boss having Lucid Dreams with the extra mana and Leech does make a difference, so if you're worried about healing those bosses, that's an option as well. And the last dungeon is Workshop. Workshop can get very difficult and tyrannical since almost the entire dungeon you're fighting the bosses anyway. By far the hardest check of this dungeon is the last boss, King Mechagon. You want to have as much single target healing as you can, as well as some mana essences or planning out on dealing with it. It's common that you'll fight the blob with the last boss as well, so this can drag on for close to 6 minutes on higher keys. There's not too much of a challenge with explosives. The only area is maybe these living wastes in Kuja's room. If you're pulling a lot of these, you may have to help with explosives. But usually when you're fighting these, you're line of sighting them, so you can also just line of sight the explosives. There's not too much I would change in here. I would be running my normal talent setup. Some people choose to run Prosperity and Soul of the Forest here. I think that's fine. It helps a little bit with the last boss, but keep in mind that when you run out of Swiftmen charges, it's going to be really hard, so you have to manage those very well. For essences, I usually just like to run Crucible Major with Preservation Minor to help with the single target healing and to give a little extra boost in damage. However, if you're really worried about the last boss, you could run Formless Major or you could run Lucid Dreams Major just to help out with your mana. And that's it. That's all the dungeons this week. Thanks for watching. I'm going to take a break from streaming for a few days since this week sucks for high keys, and we'll be back with lots of videos this week and then more high keys next week. So again, thanks for watching and happy keying.